At first, it looked like a terrible accident, something forgotten on the stove. Then the autopsy revealed that the truth was much worse. But without enough evidence, the killer was allowed to go free for 30 years, until his ex-wife brought him down. This is the story of Joy Hibbs, the Pennsylvania mom who was set on fire to cover up an argument. Hi friends, I'm Katie, and this is Katie Does Crime. Thank you for joining me for the first time if you're new here, and hello to the usual rapscallions and reprobates. Please consider subscribing or joining me on Patreon if you'd like to hear more true crime stories. On April 19, 1991, a 12-year-old boy arrived home at 1:10 p.m. in Bristol Township, Pennsylvania. It was report card week, so the students got an early dismissal. Not only was he excited to show off his honor roll certificate, but the family had a new puppy to play with. But as the boy neared the house, black smoke was streaming from the back. He saw through the door that the burners of the stove were on, as if his mom had accidentally left something cooking. He knew she was still inside. A neighbor heard the boys scream and ran to find that the doors were blocked by the quickly spreading blaze. Paramedics had to hold the boy back as he tried to run inside through the flames. Don't worry, the puppy was safe, but when the fire was extinguished, the boy's 35-year-old mother was found dead in his second-floor bedroom. All that remained of the mattress she was lying on top of were the springs. Her name was Joy Oval Hibbs, wife of Charles M. Hibbs, Jr., mother to 16-year-old Angie and 12-year-old David. She was graceful, polite, and easygoing, and she had succumbed to the smoke, or so they thought. 2 days later, on April 21st, the Philadelphia Inquirer revealed that the woman was no accidental fire victim. She was a murder victim, dead before the fire began. Someone had stabbed her 5 times in the neck and torso and strangled her with a computer power cord. There was no smoke in her lungs. The one bit of relief was that the snap from her jeans was still intact. She likely hadn't been assaulted. But still, police had to reconsider everything they'd thought about her death. They believed the fire had been set at 4 different points to hide any evidence now. They collected what they could, though. Some knives, some of Joy's clothes, and a stained flannel shirt that was in a closet but didn't seem to belong to anyone in the house. Joy's 36-year-old husband had been at his construction and maintenance job that day. The two had celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary 6 days before she died, and he was never really considered a person of interest at all. But there was no other suspect, no motive, and thanks to the fire, not much to go on. Joy's wallet was found in the living room with something like $70 missing, but that wasn't enough to make it seem like a burglary. The houses in the neighborhood were fewer than 15 feet apart there in Croydon Acres, close enough that people usually knew each other's business. Windows had been open that sunny day, and neighbors had been out in their yards. But no one had seen anything, just the 2 guys from church who had stopped by earlier to visit and ask Joy to join the congregation. Well, and the car that was haphazardly parked in front of her house at around 12:30. It was a dark blue 1980s Chevrolet Monte Carlo, and 2 neighbors only mentioned it because it was 3 feet off the curb of their otherwise neat little street. Joy had gone to the bank that morning to cash her paycheck from her medical assistant job, bought some groceries, and headed home. The preacher and another man from the local church stopped by to see her because she'd been to their Easter service a few weeks before with a coworker. They just wanted to invite her back again, but unwittingly became the prime suspects in the murder for a while. They were eventually cleared, though, and said nothing had seemed out of the ordinary that day to them. Joy's next-door neighbor said the scariest thing is that someone was able to get in and out so quickly without making a sound. The local ladies came up with a system where they would call each other with a secret code word when a delivery man stopped by, just to let everyone know they were safe. Joy's husband set to work rebuilding their home from the fire, but he couldn't rebuild the meaning in his life. "I don't believe in God anymore," he told the Philadelphia Inquirer. "If there was a God, this wouldn't have happened. She never hurt anyone in her life." He called Joy a Florida country girl who loved fishing and gardening. They just liked being together, running little errands with each other, even if the other wasn't really necessary. They liked flea markets and riding their motorcycles to nowhere in particular. Just an easy kind of contentment. Because Joy was strong and athletic, the detective on the case believed the killer could have been someone she knew, someone she would have let into the house. But he had no idea why someone would be mad at Joy Hibbs. The family put up a $5,000 reward for information. Over the years, a person of interest would come up from time to time, but their alibi would always check out. In a 2014 HuffPost article, the neighbor who first tried to enter the burning house said he had noticed a garbage man going around to the back of the house sometime after the men from the church left. That was odd to him since the garbage cans were out front. The detective who had been working the case from the beginning said this garbage man theory was a new one. His favorite suspect was a man who drove a Monte Carlo like the one seen in front of Joy's house that day. It was a neighbor who sometimes sold Joy and Charlie a little weed, maybe a quarter once a week. This guy wouldn't voluntarily take a polygraph test, which raised some red flags for the detective. But a witness said his Monte Carlo wasn't the one seen in front of the house anyway. A new detective started a fresh review of the case in 2014, and Dateline featured the case in a 2015 cold case spotlight, but nothing panned out. There just wasn't enough evidence. In May 2021, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran another story about Joy's murder. 30 years had passed, and Joy's husband, Charlie, wasn't giving up. The 66-year-old had moved to Washington State to be close to his mom and was now in a serious relationship with a woman whose husband had been murdered. But he still kept Joy's photo on the wall, one where she was smiling broadly with their 2 children. He said his high school sweetheart had lived up to her name, Joy, and he was offering $25,000 of his retirement savings to find who had taken her from him. The paper interviewed their son David, who was only 12 when he came home to find his house on fire, and he said the fear and anxiety stay with you throughout the years. Someone killed his mom, and they were still out there. Just a month later, Joy's son and a family friend matched Charlie's pledge, upping the reward to $50,000. But how much hope can you have after 3 decades of nothing? As it turns out, plenty. On May 26, 2022, just a year later, an arrest was made.
New at 5 tonight, a decades-old cold case has been solved. A Bucks County man is now behind bars for the brutal murder of a mother. It was back in 1991 when Joy Hibbs was stabbed and strangled. Her home was then set on fire to try and cover up the cause of her death. Action News reporter Walter Perez is live in Doylestown tonight with the full story. Walter.
That's right, Rick. The suspect, 56-year-old Robert Atkins, faces the very real prospect of life in prison if he's convicted for a heinous crime committed decades ago. After more than 30 years, Robert Atkins of Fairless Hills has been arrested in connection with the murder of Joy Hibbs back in 1991. Investigators say what ended as a murder investigation started as a house fire at the Hibbs family home.
After the fire was put out, Joy Hibbs was discovered dead in her son's bedroom. She was stabbed repeatedly, she had fractured ribs, and was likely asphyxiated.
Atkins, who had occasionally sold small amounts of marijuana to Joy and her husband, was always a person of interest, but authorities never felt they had enough evidence to make the connection.
It just goes to show how just keeping a case fresh in the minds of law enforcement and the public matters so much. After the articles about the reward money were published, the investigation started back up again with renewed interest, and a longtime suspect was finally put in front of a grand jury. It turns out it was the neighbor the detective had told HuffPost about back in 2014, the neighbor who sometimes sold weed to Joy and Charlie back in 1991, 56-year-old Robert Atkins. Authorities had their eyes on him for a long time, but just didn't think there was enough evidence to convict him. Now they were saying confidently that Atkins had argued with Joy over money before strangling her with a power cord and stabbing her. Atkins was charged with murder, robbery, and arson. The Bucks County District Attorney said, Robert Atkins, for the past 31 years, has been living free but on borrowed time. Today, we begin to collect on that time, with interest. Atkins admitted that he sold drugs to Joy, but said he had nothing to do with the murder. He drove a Monte Carlo in 1991, sure, but so did everyone. He said when the house went up in flames, he and his wife had been away in the Poconos. It turns out that Atkins was a confidential informant at the time, working for the township police on drug cases, so they may not have had a strong desire to question him. Now it came out that Atkins's alibi wasn't as airtight as originally thought. He and his wife had divorced, and although she was too scared of him at first to say anything, she had actually gone to the police in 2016. She said they weren't in the Poconos when Joy died. In fact, Atkins had come home that afternoon covered in blood and soot and told her he had stabbed someone and lit a house on fire. He patted his pocket, referencing the folding knife he was known to always have on him, and then he forced his wife to skip work right then and there so they could drive to the Poconos. During their weekend there, she saw Atkins get rid of a bag in the woods. Atkins's wife won't face any charges. She said she was remorseful over having waited so long to speak up, But even when she did, it hadn't been enough to convince investigators they had the evidence they needed. It wasn't until Joy's son David was in front of the grand jury that all the circumstantial pieces formed a whole picture. It turns out that his mom hadn't been pleased with some of the weed Adkins had sold her weeks before her death. It was all stems and seeds. When she insisted on a refund, Adkins had become violent and said, "I will blow up your house and I will kill you." He also called Joy's workplace with a similar threat. And the family sort of knew who was to blame when their back door was kicked in and Joy's tires were slashed shortly after. After a hearing in September 2022 where he pleaded not guilty, Adkins was set to go to trial. In the meantime, more witnesses came forward and said this wasn't the first time Robert Adkins had been violent. Adkins's younger brother said Robert's first victim was nearly a mirror of Joy, a thin 35-year-old brunette with a Southern accent. Robert had been sent to live with family in Tennessee in 1981 when he was a teenager, and something set him off one day. He attacked this woman, his own aunt, strangling her with a telephone cord, eerily similar to how he attacked Joy with a computer power cord. Robert said he was on bad drugs and had heard voices that made him do it. His aunt was nearly left for dead, but managed to recover and somehow forgive her nephew. And now the family wanted the court to know. However, there was no arrest record for the incident, either because the aunt never pressed charges or because Robert was a juvenile. Authorities weren't even sure how much of the story was real and how much of it was one of those legends passed down through a family. The aunt wasn't around to tell her tale anymore. But Robert's cousin had proof. She found a note pressed between the pages of her aunt's cookbook, written on toilet paper. It was an apology from Robert. At trial in January 2024, Adkins's defense lawyer could only say that the detectives mishandled evidence and wrongfully zeroed in on his client back in 1991. Adkins admitted to the argument over the marijuana, but said Joy and Charlie had already smoked some of it, so it's not like he could return to the dealer he used. But this would have been an argument over $20 or $40, hardly worth killing someone over. He had an excuse for not wanting to take the polygraph before, too. He said he had a torn nerve at the time, and his attorney told him that nerve damage could throw off the test. Unfortunately for Adkins, his ex-wife had allowed herself to be wiretapped as she called him one time back in 2021 and told him the police were on to him. He told her not to say anything and that he'd explained everything to Gabriel. Gabriel was their son, and he testified that his dad had told him, "I'm afraid I'm getting arrested for something that happened a long time ago." Not exactly the words of an innocent man. The trial lasted less than a week, and Robert Adkins was convicted of first-degree murder and 2 counts of arson. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, 5 to 10 years for one of the arson counts, and 10 to 20 years concurrent for the second arson count. In a victim impact statement at the sentencing, Joy's husband Charlie read, "Joy was my high school sweetheart, my first love, mother to my children, and the loving soul that kept our family together. The choice he made that day broke our hearts, but strengthened us as a family. According to my faith, I am supposed to forgive, and I am finding difficulty in doing so. But I hope that Mr. Adkins lives to be a very old man and thinks about the choices he made that day and all the things he has missed while spending time incarcerated. As this nightmare comes to an end for my family, his is about to start." His son David said, "We're sorry that it took 32 years to get here, but we finally got justice for Joy." So there you have it, a murder over a handful of weed. I just found this case so especially interesting because both the family and the police seemed to know who the killer was and just couldn't do anything about it. I almost couldn't believe that the detective actually mentioned the suspect's name out loud in the article back in 2014. Imagine the fear Adkins lived in after that. But maybe he thought they'd never have enough evidence to get him. It's pretty incredible how law enforcement kept pushing until they had enough pieces to complete the puzzle. As always, please let me know what you think about this case in the comments. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm just a true crime fan like you are, and I really appreciate you taking a chance on me. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like spending this time together. I would be so appreciative. Until next time, I'm Katie, and this has been Katie Does Crime.